Hello and welcome to this British Psychological Society audio interview. I'm Wendy Barnaby and I'm joined by Stephen Lea, Emeritus Professor of Psychology at the University of Exeter and the lead on the British Psychological Society's Behaviour Change Advisory Group on personal debt. And that's what we're going to be talking about, Stephen, personal debt and your research into it. But it's very interesting, isn't it? Because we don't necessarily think we are in debt, even when we owe money.
Yes, well, there is a big difference between what counts as debt from an accounting point of view and what people perceive as a debt. From an accounting point of view, if there's been any contract where I'm going to pay you money for something and I haven't yet paid it, that's a debt. But we don't think of that as debt if the situation's under control, authorised, and so on. A typical example is a house mortgage. If you ask a sample of people, do you have any debt? Most people will say, well, no. And then a little later you ask them, do you own a house? And they say, well, yes, on a mortgage, of course. And that mortgage is a debt. But we don't think of it as a debt because it's an agreed arrangement and you're paying it back in the agreed way and everything's under control. And we only start to think of it as a debt if things go out of control. You start slipping behind on your mortgage payments and you will say to yourself, yes, I'm in debt.
Is there a sort of person who gets into debt?
Yes and no. There's been quite a lot of effort to relate levels of debt to psychological factors like personality, attitudes, and so on. But actually, the answer is rather simpler than that. There are sorts of people who get into debt, and the most obvious sort of person is people with little money. And unless you get that basic economic fact in first, you're not going to get anywhere trying to study the psychology of debt. So if you look at people who have severe debt, they are mostly people with very low incomes and also high necessary outgoings, usually dependent children or other dependents, for example, disabled relatives and so on. So it's extremely difficult to cut down on expenditure. One of the other sorts of people who tend to have, or at least to be getting into debt, is simply young people. And one of the things you realise when you look at students' financial behaviour is that students make a lot of financial mistakes. But often that doesn't matter. Most students come from the more prosperous half of the population, and it's still true that many students go on to get well-paid jobs. So their initial mistakes at handling their financial affairs in the student years get either wiped out by indulgent parents or they're able to live them down as a result of getting a well-paid job. It is less so if you are a young person from a disadvantaged background with no parental financial resources behind you, not much prospect of a good job or any job at all, and then you make a few financial mistakes. Let's say you buy too many things from a mail order catalogue and you can't quite pay it back. And then interest charges mount up. And then you borrow money from a payday lender and you start racking up enormous interest charges. And so what was actually a fairly small mistake resulting in a fairly small debt can still be with you 20-odd years later on a hugely enhanced scale.
And what are the psychological consequences of this sort of debt?
I think the most serious one is that debt is correlated with and probably a contributory cause to clinical levels of depression, in extreme cases, suicides. And that is over and above the influence of poverty as such, which is also a trigger factor for depression. There are other psychological consequences of debt. One of the slightly worrying ones, in a certain sense, is a change of attitudes. If you have debts, you become less averse to having debt. So that debt becomes kind of acceptable. And when you have debt, well, there are well-known psychological theories that say you can't be very intolerant of something you yourself do.
But you say that the sort of advice that is given to people who are in debt, which is get in touch with your creditors, try and work something out with them, do it cooperatively, don't wait till they come banging on your door, that sort of advice is useless.
I'm afraid it is. I don't think going and talking to your creditors is the first thing to do. The first thing to do is to face up to the situation. If the problem is serious, go and talk to Consumers Advice or one of the specialist charities and get onto the problem sooner rather than later. And don't try and solve it by borrowing money from a firm whose name I won't mention, or any of that sort, let alone from someone who comes and knocks at your door. It will only make matters worse. The major source of debt, insofar as we have been able to understand it, is shortage of money. And if you occupy a position of influence in a large business that has a debt problem with consumers, your best approach is not to persecute the consumers who aren't paying you. Your best approach is to address the government policies that are causing those people not to have enough money to pay you. You have the influence, they don't.
And is this what the work on debt is for, really? To have a practical effect on people who are in debt and to help them get out of that debt?
That's certainly the reason why it's worth doing from a societal point of view. There are also reasons why it's worth doing from a theoretical psychology point of view, because actually debt, along with saving, is a very interesting kind of behaviour, because it involves making a choice between what you will have now and what you will have in the future. If you take a loan, you're choosing to have more now and less in the future. And the converse of that, obviously, is saving, where you choose to have less now and more in the future, for example, when you save for a pension. And as it happens, this is one of those areas of behaviour where the predictions of what I think of as old-fashioned economics, 20th century mathematical economics, which tried to explain everything about human behaviour by assuming that humans always do the thing that is best for them. The predictions of such a rationality theory, as it's called, are most completely wrong. And therefore studying what people actually do in such situations is of particular interest in trying to construct a theory of real economic behaviour as distinct from the behaviour of this imaginary person who always does what is best for himself or herself.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed.